Hey gang, Mary Rose here. I'm going to put down this little blue banner. It always makes me deal with how short I am. It's always like a wake-up call when I put this blue banner up and I'm like, oh, I really need to sit up straight to see you all and to let you see me. If you're watching on Facebook, do the thing you're being asked to do. Go to streamyard.com/Facebook. Give permission to show your name. This way I'll know who you are when you leave a comment, as Anne has already done. Hi, Anne, and hello to Hillary as well. And hello to all the rest of you that are here live. And hello to the rest of you who are going to be watching the replay. This is what we call a flash forward in fiction. I'm jumping ahead to some future date after this live stream is completed and it's a replay, and you out there in the future are watching it. It's so cool, the things that we can do in fiction, isn't it? I'm so pleased to see you all. Greetings to Constanza. There was a Facebook user who said hello and hello everyone. And so if you want to reveal your identities, do the instruction, just go to the link that's probably at the top of the screen if you're watching on Facebook, and click on that little link. And if you're just Facebook user today, that's fine. Just know that that's why I'm not saying hello to you by name. All right, speaking of names, who am I? I'm Mary Rose Wood. I'm so pleased to be here with you today. Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Pacific time, I go live on this Path of the Storyteller YouTube channel, also broadcasting into the Path of the Storyteller Facebook group to talk about writing craft, story structure, and the mindset of the working writer. And today we're going to talk about something provocative, and is, I think, a conversation that's going to go in various directions, and that is also going to make use of some input from all of you. And the question on our table today is this: what makes work endure? What makes creative work endure? What makes our writing potentially endure? And when I say endure, I mean what people mean when they say it's a classic. It's been around for a while. It remains relevant. It's just as engaging now as it was when it was written. We can predict that this particular work will continue to have readers into the future. So it's a very different metric of accomplishment than it made the bestseller list or my friends liked it. It's a kind of a swing for the fences type ambition. And I want to pose two questions today, basically. I want to talk about what qualities make a work endure, or would seem likely to make a work endure. And then I also want to talk about whether we as writers can learn something from the answers to the first part of our discussion, and whether we should consider consciously aiming for this quality of being a classic. Is it something that we can aim for? Is it something we have any control over whatsoever? Is thinking about it going to cause us to up our game in any way? So it's super interesting topic, I think, to discuss. And I want to thank those of you who sent me emails, because I sent out an email to people on my mailing list last week asking for a little input on this topic. And so if you didn't get that email, woe betide you. It means that it is possible that you're not on my mailing list. And I just want to take a second here to ask you to join the mailing list. It's www.pathofthestoryteller.com. And Path of the Storyteller is where I do my mentoring and teaching to writers who are thoughtful and interested in how good writing works, who are ambitious for their own writing, not necessarily because they've set out to write a classic every time they sit down to work, although maybe some of you do. I'm going to be interested to hear about that. But who are ambitious to improve, who are not just, settling for writing as a purely hobby level endeavor, but people who are kind of interested in writing work that's worthy of being shared with others. So that's what I mean by leveling up. So let's dive in. Oh, lots of folks here. Avon's here. Awesome. So nice to see you, Avon and Terry. Wonderful. So I want to make a confession about where I got this an idea to talk about the quality of being a classic. And there were really two sources, and they kind of collided last week. One of them, of course, was that it's April when I'm doing this live stream. And last week we had April 23rd, which is the date which we typically observe as the birth date of Shakespeare. Now, what could be more classic than Shakespeare? We've got centuries of Shakespeare under our belts as a culturally ravenous species, and we are likely to have centuries more. So I think about Shakespeare. I happen to be a big fan and find lots of inspiration in the work of Shakespeare. And whenever I think about Shakespeare, I do think about the sheer unlikelihood, in a sense, of his work enduring. And he was a very popular playwright in his own day, but he was not living the life of, what I think many of us fantasize about, which is that, oh, if only my life could be peaceful and calm and still, and I didn't have to worry about, other people's interruptions, and I didn't have to worry about earning a living. I didn't have to worry about all these things. If I didn't have to worry about, the drama and the interruption of the outside world, then I could really achieve my full potential as a writer. This is a universal fantasy. So if you've never felt this, I don't believe you. We all have this feeling of like, if only life were a little easier, I could be a better writer. It's just truth, right? But if you look at Shakespeare and you say, oh my gosh, like, how did he even have time to write? It was such a difficult era that he lived in. There was all kinds of political unrest. There was plague. He was in an environment in the London theater of that era, which was very competitive. There were, a bunch of theaters sort of competing for the audiences. You had to have royal patrons to really have a go of it. And it was just all very busy. And so the people who were successful were not just playwrights who, worked in this peaceful little garret and sent their plays into, theater competitions or things like we would take for granted today. Like, oh, I'll have my agent, submit it for me. Like, no, Shakespeare had to run his own theater. He was a businessman. He was an actor on the stage and probably acted in his own plays. He had to deal with the politics of the era. He had to, please the nobility. He had to entertain the groundlings. Like he was just swamped. You just can imagine. Anybody who's ever done theater knows how much work it is to put on a show. Like, you have to learn it. You have to rehearse it. There's props, there's costumes, there's promotion. Who's minding the box office, And so this was a business enterprise, and a very demanding one, And he had to turn out a lot of plays because it was a competitive environment. The audience wanted a new play. They wanted to see something new. And they would perform his plays in repertory. You could go to the theater and see a different play every afternoon. We would say every night, but of course they performed in the daytime because they didn't have artificial lighting. So they're outdoors, like these open theaters, performing outdoors. You just can imagine what chaos it was. And he had to write work that would work in this very difficult environment, but he also had to do it in the context of a life that was just so busy. And then boom, the plague comes and the theaters are closed for months. And then where is the money coming from? I mean, it's just fantastic to think about. So I always use Shakespeare as a kind of personal corrective. Like, if he could write all that stuff under such chaotic circumstances, who are we to insist upon our meditation garden and our cup of perfectly brewed tea and no interruptions and our noise canceling headphones? Like, we should just do the work, get over ourselves and do the work. So partly it was Shakespeare that was making me think about what constitutes, that magic formula that makes work endure century after century after century. I'm just as into these plays now, as I can imagine his audience was at the time. But there's another thing that happened, came across the transom, if you will, that made me think about that. And it actually had to do with, wait for it, Frankenstein. And what came across my desk was a really interesting email from the valuable Jane Friedman. If you're not on her email list, you should get on it. She has a terrific blog with lots of great advice for writers. And she often has guest bloggers. I see we've got a thumbs up for Jane Friedman. Yeah, she's just really valuable, smart, knowledgeable about the publishing industry. So she had a guest blogger on, a writer named Catherine Bob Miguira. I may not be pronouncing that perfectly, Catherine, so I apologize if you hear this. But Catherine wrote an absolutely terrific guest blog post, and the title was this: Why Frankenstein Still Sells 40,000 Copies a Year. Well, I had to read that blog post, right? It just kind of hit me in that while I was in that what makes Shakespeare endure mood. And I was like, that's right, Frankenstein. Yes. What is it about Frankenstein? And so we're going to talk a little bit about Frankenstein. We're going to talk a little bit about Shakespeare, but we're going to start by talking about some of you. And I want to dip into the things that you shared with me in your emails from last week. I'm not going to bring up whole emails onto the screen. You forgive me just for the interest of time, but just bring out like the points that you made. And I want to start with a point that was made by Sonia, who sent me a wonderful email. And one of the things that Sonia emphasized in her email was that she felt that an enduring work was one that had a theme that captures the reader's heart. So she went right to this idea of emotion, the theme that captures the reader's heart. Now, this was an idea that came up in a few of the emails that I got, that when you really think about it, that there's an emotional component to a classic. And so right away, I start to unravel, like, oh, what does it mean to capture someone's heart? And I think that's a really interesting question. And it's not so simple as just saying, oh, it's got something emotional in it, right? Like lots of things can be emotional, but to capture a reader's heart is such a beautiful phrase. And I want to weave into this comment from Sonia, another really great comment from Trisha, who sent me a very thoughtful email about what constitutes a classic. And she shared that she thought it was a story that evokes some emotion or longing. Oh, wonderful phrases. And she added that she thought that characters that she could relate to emotionally were the key. And she made a wonderful comment that she felt that that was more important than some of the more superficial aspects of a story, like where is it set and like what is it about. And she noted that even if I didn't think that I wanted to read a story set in the French Revolution, if the characters' emotions hooked me, then I'm all of a sudden interested. I'm interested in that character's emotional experience, even if it's a story set in the French Revolution. And if you had asked me before, I would have said, nah, I'm not really interested. And so Trisha's sort of adding to Sonia's observation that if the emotional content of a story literally captures our hearts, it can take us places where we didn't even know we were willing to go. And I thought that was just such a terrific observation. So now I want to pivot a little bit. Now that we've talked about this idea of capturing the reader's heart on an emotional level, let's pivot a little bit to Frankenstein. In the blog post that I mentioned earlier, and I'll link to it down below so you guys can go find it on Jane Friedman's site. The analysis is made about Frankenstein that it deals with sort of thematic questions of profound emotional heft. And the summary of this, you've got two principal characters in the tale of Frankenstein, which, by the way, of course, I'm sure most of you know this already, but it's such a remarkable story of how Frankenstein got written in the first place. It was written by 18-year-old Mary Shelley, and which, just goes to show that, dystopian YA fiction has been around for longer than maybe we're willing to admit. But there's this character, Dr. Frankenstein, Victor Frankenstein, and he's ambitious. He's an ambitious scientist. And what happens to him is that he lets his ambition run the show, and he chooses to do something that was arguably wrong. His morally complex decision to build this, we call it the monster, this to reanimate this creature, to create this creature out of parts of corpses. I mean, it's just sort of horrific, right? It's like this incredible sci-fi / medical horror, genres that we can kind of continue to relate to. But the question here is, why did he do it? And he did it because he let his ambition get the better of him. He was driven by ambition. And ambition is one of those ideas, that we can talk about, like the way we can talk about greed. I think ambition and greed are sort of words that in a sense mean the same thing. It's just a hunger. It's an insatiable hunger for something that maybe we shouldn't be wanting in the first place, or we should, or that the wanting of it into this excess takes on this quality of a moral transgression, right? It's okay to want money, but to sacrifice everything else for money feels like a moral collapse. I'm thinking of Ebenezer Scrooge, for example, or you can think of the very end of the Hobbit, right, which is a book about greed, among other things. I mean, the central MacGuffin of the Hobbit, if you will, is this pile of gold that's being guarded by a dragon, and the full action of the Hobbit is essentially an attempt to get that gold from the dragon. Now, whether the folks who are attempting to get the gold from the dragon have a virtuous claim that it was theirs to begin with or belonged to their ancestors, whatever, right? I mean, these are the kinds of arguments that propel human history. Well, it was ours back in the day, so we want to get it back, right? Like this is the kind of stuff that plays out in real life century after century. But this idea of greed, of sort of wanting something to the point where you start to sacrifice more human values. So in the case of Dr. Frankenstein, it's ambition, it's greed, but this is like a very kind of core human failing. And then what happens? Oh, before I go on to, and then what happens, when I say a core human failing, I want to introduce a word that I'm sure most of you know, which is hubris. And this is a word that gets talked about when people, study Greek tragedy. It's the sense of, wanting too much. The Greek myth of Icarus, who wanted to fly and had a set of wings made out of wax, feathers and wax, held together by wax. And then what does he do? He flies too close to the sun. And the wax melts, the wings fall apart, and Icarus plunges to his death. So this is like a mythological expression of this idea of hubris, of wanting too much, like just not knowing your place. You didn't stay in your lane, humans. You went too far. If you just take that in for a second, like an exploration of what happens when humans don't stay in their lane and go too far, and contemplate how profound this theme is, how central and timeless it is. Talk about a timeless theme. All right. And then what happens? The creature is created by the excess ambition of Dr. Frankenstein. And so now there's this monster, this horrible monster that exists, that didn't ask to be born, but is now walking around. And what does that monster want? The monster wants love. Oh, talk about a human emotion. This monster didn't ask to be born, didn't ask to be created, didn't ask to be brought into existence, but he has been. And now he wants love. Because why? Because that's what we all want. But he's a monster and he can't have it. So the incredible, simple cruelty of the creature's predicament is just heartrending. And what does the creature do? The creature seeks revenge. That's the plot of Frankenstein, basically. It's like an opera. It's so primal. It's just human emotion. And it's human emotion played out on this fantastic level, but it's human emotion that we like literally can all relate to instantly. And so I think that this quality that both Sonia and Trisha identified, this way of capturing the reader's heart, um, or a story that evokes emotion or longing, or even a character, as Trisha says, that she can relate to emotionally. This is so central. Maybe you wouldn't think that you would enjoy a story about a mad scientist who created a monster. Like maybe that's not your thing. But if I told you that, there was a story about someone who wanted to be loved and couldn't be, and then, you know, struck out in revenge, that story could play out in any number of scenarios. And like Trisha, you would say, hey, I'm on board for that because I feel that too. I can feel that in my own heart. So that's super interesting, right? And so this is a conclusion that is drawn in this discussion of Frankenstein, and the conclusion that is drawn is this: that a great premise is essential to making something a classic. And so, when this blogger says premise, she's not talking so much about the emotional content, but what she's describing, I would say, is that it's baked into the central idea of the story, that these primal human emotions are baked into the premise. That's how I would put it. So that's the definition, like, of a great premise. And sometimes we think about that as writers, like, what's a great premise for a story? And we might let that question mislead us into thinking that we've got to come up with a really complicated idea, that a great premise is something complicated or something that no one's ever done before, that has that quality about it. It's going to blow people's minds. This premise is going to blow people's minds. But I just want you to consider that a great premise might be better defined as the one that has primal human emotions, inarguable human emotions that any of us could say, oh, gosh, wow, he shouldn't have made that creature. He should have stopped himself. He went too far. But we can see that play out in life, in human history, over and over and over again. It rings a bell with us. And we can also say, oh my gosh, that creature is a monster and is never going to be loved, right? Never going to find love, because life is like that. But wants it so, because how could any of us not want love? It's so powerful. So think about your definition of a great premise and see, how big of a role emotion plays in it. Now, here's another interesting quote, and this is a quote attributed to Adam Gopnik, a wonderful writer. And he was talking not about Frankenstein, but about H.G. Wells in a piece that he wrote for the New Yorker. And he was kind of similarly pondering, why does H.G. Wells' work endure? Why do we continue to be interested in those stories? And Adam Gopnik wrote that the premises are so simple and strong that they can sustain any amount of retelling. So I want to pivot now to a word that nobody used in responding to my question about what makes something a classic. But based on thinking about Frankenstein, thinking about Shakespeare, Gopnik's really insightful observation about H.G. Wells, I want to throw this word into the mix. And few of us think about it, I think. Adaptability. If a premise has got that kind of simple strength, it can be adapted, by which I mean retold and retold and retold again and again, and it never falls apart. Not only doesn't it fall apart, each generation is likely to have a fresh urge to retell this story. So, for example, how many versions of Frankenstein have there been? right? There have been so many versions of it. There have been movies made of it, and more movies, and stage plays, and I mean, it gets retold a lot. We never really get tired of this idea of the mad scientist and the creature, right? That he thinks that he can control and who turns against him. And you can even look at other stories that are not explicitly retellings of Frankenstein and just look for that idea. The human being who is swept away by ambition and then has to deal with the consequences of what they've created. The thing that they made that they thought they owned and could control rises up against them. There's so many stories that have that central theme. I'm even just saying that, I'm thinking of Blade Runner, but there's so many stories. There's so many stories that have that kind of theme. So think about that. Adaptability. If we pivot now for a minute of looking at Shakespeare, oh my gosh. Shakespeare's plays get put on every single year, everywhere, all over the place. They get told and retold and retold. They get turned into musicals, like West Side Story, right, is a retelling of Romeo and Juliet. They get turned into movies. Some of our Oscar nominated movies this year were retelling of Shakespeare plays. There was a new adaptation of Macbeth. We're still as interested in telling these stories. Actors want to play these parts. Directors want to interpret them. Audiences want to see them. And so when a story has this quality of being able to hold up through retelling and adaptation, this is a factor in its ability to endure. Now, interestingly, and I may have mentioned it once before on this channel, some months ago, I was doing a bit of research into the classic tale Pinocchio. Now, who hasn't heard of Pinocchio? The answer? No one. Everyone has heard of Pinocchio. Literally everyone has heard of Pinocchio. And it turns out that this tale of Pinocchio, which was probably made here in the West, most well known in popular culture by, a Disney film adaptation. And Disney is no slouch when it comes to recognizing stories that are ripe for retelling. But Pinocchio, of course, was an Italian novel. And yet, if you go back to the original Italian novel, the core scenes, the basic premise is unchanging. Like a lot of the things that get told over and over again about Pinocchio are just in the original. There's something about it that holds up. And the reason I mentioned Pinocchio is that somebody looked into it. I don't know who, but and determined that of any story that's been retold and adapted in countless ways, Pinocchio is like the most adapted non-religious story that there is. And I'm like, are you kidding me? This like little Italian novel, but that it has this quality. What's Pinocchio about? What's Pinocchio about? Is anyone out there saying, oh my gosh, Pinocchio's like practically the same plot as Frankenstein, isn't it? In a way it is. In a way it is. It's obviously different, in key ways. But it's basically the story of a woodworker named Geppetto who longs for a child and makes one out of wood. And then the creature that he makes turns out to be highly problematic, disobedient, runs off, and then we get to watch the spiritual growth of Pinocchio as he goes through all of these adventures. And in the end, a much happier ending, of course, than Frankenstein. But just notice, is it mere coincidence that these stories have this quality of longing for love? And it's distributed a little differently because Geppetto is longing for love. He's longing for a child, right? And so he makes one out of wood. Luckily for him, it's magic wood, but he creates life out of wood. And then once he's done it, the creature that he creates is no longer something that he can control, and it breaks his heart. He builds a child for himself, seeking love, seeking to be a father, but the child that he creates ends up breaking his heart, and then they go on this journey together, and Pinocchio has to, find his humanity, much like the creature in Frankenstein. So a little bit of mind blown there, and you just see these themes. If you sort of, and I love to do this exercise sometimes about any story really, is to just like let your vision blur a little bit about the details of it and see if you can find the spine, the architecture, that thing that captures the reader's hearts. Like what are the basic boulders, that are just kind of in opposition? And you start to see, oh, all these stories are the same. Interesting. All right. So this quality of adaptability, I would imagine, is not something that we all think of when we sit down to work. Like, could this be adapted into a ballet, a musical, a movie, a puppet show, a graphic novel, a TV series? Writers often will, long for those things because it's a way of the story kind of gaining notoriety. But I wonder how we think of it in terms of this insight about what's baked into the premise. Is it simple and strong enough to withstand? I once heard a theater director observe about A Midsummer Night's Dream that you can put on A Midsummer Night's Dream with basically a class full of kindergartners, and it would work. It would work. It would be delightful, and they would be able to tell the story. And it's very true. And sometimes you want to think about, like, is it going to pass that test, the kindergartner test? So I want to bring in some really great comments now from Nancy. I don't know if Nancy's here today, but Nancy sent me a wonderful, detailed email having to do with a few things that we've touched upon. And she talked specifically about character. When we talk about this deep strength of a premise based on human feeling, then that premise becomes iconic in a way, right? But within each iconic premise, there are characters who become iconic potentially. And Nancy noted, and this is so insightful, that a work that it contains or revolves around an iconic character has a big leg up when it comes to whether or not it becomes a classic, when it's enduring or not. Now, look at the works that we've already mentioned a little bit. Dr. Frankenstein, The Creature, Pinocchio, Geppetto. I mean, these characters are like realer than real. They are iconic characters. And when a character rises out of a premise with that kind of simplicity and strength, then that character comes to embody something that starts to feel eternal, right? And I really love this insight that Nancy shared, because it's something else that we can think about when we sit down to write. Are the characters that we're creating potentially iconic? Have we created a Bilbo Baggins, a Jane Eyre, a Tony Soprano? Pick your form. Have we created a character that seems to somehow lift not only off the page, but somehow even out of the bounds of the story itself, so that character now has that sort of magic, dust about them, that quality of being so simple and clear, and having something so compelling baked into the premise that the character takes on a life of its own. Everyone knows who Hamlet is, and most of them have never read Hamlet, right? There's just something about these characters that they embody the iconic quality of the stories that they rise from. Now, I just want to say, when I would say many of my students are working on a piece, they sometimes almost talk themselves down from the desire to create characters of this kind of iconic heft, and that there's a lot more concern than perhaps there ought to be about characters being relatable or nice or believable, plausible, And again, I just want to throw this out to you. And we're going to, round this up at the end about how you as a writer can absorb and maybe be influenced by some of the topics of this discussion. Are you thinking about characters that are unforgettable, that could potentially be iconic in this way? Have you endowed your characters, particularly the heroes of your story, with qualities that are so striking and that it have this ability to capture the reader's heart, that they themselves can lift not only off the page, but maybe out of the very story that you're writing to introduce them? All right, love that. Now, I want to talk about something that is so cool. And I had not heard of this before, researching my notes for today's talk. So I'm always so grateful to learn something new. How many of you are familiar with the phrase, the Lindy effect? If you're not, well, guess what? I wasn't familiar with it either. But the Lindy effect is a phrase that embodies the idea that things that endure, just based on the fact that they have endured this long, tend to continue to endure. Now, I want to give a shout out again to Sonia, who in her note to me noted that popularity can be a factor in whether or not a work becomes a classic. If it was popular when it first was released into the marketplace or to the public, surely that initial platform of popularity helps enhance its chances to remain popular, because guess what? We've heard of it. People have heard of it. Like, there's word of mouth. We know about it. And therefore it does, in fact, remain popular. And so, Sonia, I just want you to know, great minds think alike. You have also invented the Lindy effect. But let me tell you where the oh, I just saw that Nancy is in fact here. Very good. Facebook user is actually Nancy. I'm delighted that you're here, Nancy. Good, because I'm coming back to another comment from you in a minute. I'm really glad you're here. So let's talk about this idea of the Lindy effect. Now, when I saw the word Lindy, I was like, what, the dance? Oh, my friends, it's better than that. The Lindy effect is actually named after Lindy's Delicatessen in New York City. Shouting out to New York and the great delicatessens of New York history, most of which are gone now. The Lindy effect, the phrase, was actually invented by the comedians, the stand-up comedians who played Lindy's Delicatessen, or used to hang out at Lindy's Delicatessen, I should say. And what they would do is they would talk about the longevity of a particular comedian's career, and that this would be like, the longer someone was around, the longer they were likely to stay around. And this became known as the Lindy effect. I love this kind of thing. Here I am thinking there was a scientific study. No, it was just a bunch of comics sitting around Lindy's Delicatessen in New York. Oh, this is the kind of thing that makes me so pleased. All right, but let's get serious for a minute. I think these comedians were onto something. If the longer something survives, does that enhance its chance of surviving? Now, interestingly, people have thought about this in a more philosophical way, because in terms of biology, or what we can call organic systems, like every day that we survive, if we have made it to adulthood, every day that we survive actually decreases our lifespan, right? Because we're moving toward an endpoint. We have a natural endpoint, right? But things that don't have a natural endpoint, every day that they survive actually increases their potential lifespan. And there's a lot of truth to be gleaned from this. And so I believe that this quality of the Lindy effect and the quality of adaptability are synergistic, right? Because every time something gets adapted, retold, made into a ballet, adapted into an orchestral suite, turned into a graphic novel, it's like the clock starts ticking again, and it is going to live to see another day. Another generation will fall in love with it. And so you can see that the lifespan, it's like those, video games where you can just kind of keep getting new lives. If you do well enough with adaptability, and you keep getting a new life. And so the Lindy effect then kind of supports you. It's enough to make you crave a pastrami sandwich, is it not? So I really love looking at those two ideas together, and I hope you find that as amusing as I do. Now, let's talk as we wind up. Oh, actually, before let's not talk as we wind up. Let me just take a pause because look at all this fantastic stuff going on in the comments. Really, really fun stuff. Hey, let's bring up this comment from Terry. Terry's adding to this mix, this quality of rereadability, loving a book as much the second or third time around. I so agree with that. To me, that's a hallmark of a really well executed book. It's better the more you read it. I think all of our favorite books have that quality, right? Something that sets a book apart from something that's just like, I read it once and then I gave it away. I knew I wasn't going to want to read that again. And I think, and feel free to follow up with another commentary, but to me, that quality of rereadability has to do with exactly the emotional journey that both Sonia and Trisha talked about, because it's a journey you just want to take again and again. You want to take that journey again. It's so satisfying. And I want to talk about why it's satisfying in a minute and bring back something that Nancy shared. And look at this wonderful comment from Anne. A great premise is more likely to be the kinds of questions each generation finds themselves asking or struggling with. Absolutely, right? And Anne, this is so important to highlight because there are questions that are disposable questions, depending on how we frame them. Like a question that is so timely, I don't know, I'm just going to, off the top of my head, in the headlines today, Netflix is having a bad earnings and CNN just launched a streaming service, and then they had to cancel it a month after they launched it. So therefore streaming is dead. What are we to do about it? Now there's like an awful lot of newsprint in the media and entertainment press about what happened to streaming. Who cares? That's what I say. Who cares what happens to streaming? We got along fine without it. We'll get along fine after it's gone. This is not an enduring question. But the question of how do you find love when the world sees you as a monster is good for Frankenstein. It's good for Cyrano de Bergerac. It's good for Beauty and the Beast. Go ahead. You name 3 more. Name 10 more. This is the kind of story that has that quality that is eternal because people need love. They want it. They always want it. They're always going to look for it. And if they are thwarted, things can happen. Things, this is just one of the eternal plots. So that's great. Let's see what else. Jaren, thanks for pointing this out. The movie AI follows essentially the same premise. So it's basically a Frankenstein retelling from what I'm gleaning from you, Jaren, that it's certainly a story that gets told and told and told and told and told. Now, Jaren has another comment here. Do I believe it's still possible for a brand new adaptable spine to be created from scratch in our future? And how much flexibility could those interpreters have? Awesome question. So we're talking about these iconic stories, iconic characters, things that have adaptability. And all of the examples, of course, that I use are stories that are familiar to us because that's the topic. But Jaren is asking a very practical question. Is it still possible for a brand new adaptable spine to be created from scratch? So, Jaren, I'm just going to guess that you are familiar with Star Wars, right? And this is going to bring us back to something that Nancy shared. So this is a great weaving in of ideas. Anybody who's familiar with Star Wars probably knows that when Star Wars was being conceived of, that George Lucas was extremely interested in, the hero's journey. And in fact, the very last interview that that Campbell taped before he died is this PBS special with Bill Moyers, and it's all shot at George Lucas's Skywalker Ranch. So Joseph Campbell talking about the hero's journey. Moyer's interviewing him. It's a great series. You can still find it on YouTube, probably on, I don't know, streaming services if they still exist. I'm sure you can find it. But when we talk about the hero's journey in Joseph Campbell, what we're talking about essentially, Jaren, is what you've just asked, which is, can we create new stories that have this kind of iconic heft? And the answer, of course, I believe is yes, because look how successful Star Wars is. This was a story that was created very intentionally with that model in mind. Now, is Star Wars going to have the staying power of Shakespeare? That's a very interesting question. But when we look at stories that have this mythic heft, they do seem to have legs, as they say in show business. They do seem to stick around. Again, look at The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. We can see that these worlds continue to be created. These iconic characters continue to be created. Now, Nancy, in her note about what constitutes a classic, mentioned the hero's journey, and I was very grateful that she did, because this is something that I believe, and I believe it so wholeheartedly, that it's inflected my personal practice as a writer, and also the model of story structure that I share with my students at the Path of the Storyteller program. And in a sense, I'm tipping my own hat, or tipping my own position about whether we should be thinking about writing enduring work when we sit down to work, because I think that we should consider basing our work on some of these hero's journey archetypes. And big shout out, of course, thank you very much to Avon, who is an expert on this work. And just in case any of you don't know who we're talking about, Joseph Campbell and the Bill Moyer series called The Power of Myth. Thank you, Avon. I want everyone to check it out if you don't know that stuff. So we can consciously use this sort of material to explore what those iconic human questions are. We can also look at information like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which I've also talked about on this channel, the kinds of things that seem to transcend history, transcend to a large extent culture. Even though different cultures have different value systems, all human beings do tend to crave security, love, sense of belonging in society, having some kind of legacy or sense that they have fulfilled their potential in life. I mean, these are very universal and timeless qualities. And so I do think that we can think about them consciously. Now, I want to talk just for a minute, since it was part of the inspiration for this. I want to talk just for a minute about Shakespeare. And another quality that Shakespeare has that is just a different way, a practical way that we can look at what is so enduring about Shakespeare's work. And some of you may relate to this. We talk, as contemporary writers, we talk sometimes about genre, and sometimes we talk about a genre with a slightly dismissive sense, like, oh, it's a romance, oh, it's horror, oh, it's a mystery, oh, it's, a procedural, it's a crime story, oh, it's, one of those ripped from the headlines type stories, and yet we look around popular culture and that's all we see, right? We see romance, we see mystery, we see ripped from the headlines, we see crime drama, right? It's what we see. That's what populates storytelling. And I just want to point out to you that Shakespeare was like a genius at genre. And if you look at his plays, which I hope you do, you're going to see very quickly that he wrote several distinct genres of plays. And Shakespeare scholars actually categorize them. They weren't the first to categorize them. The actors who created the first folio, which was the first sort of comprehensive published written collection of Shakespeare's plays, which wasn't done until after his death, divided them. There are there are tragedies and there are comedies and there are histories. And scholars talk about Shakespeare's plays as the tragedies, the comedies, histories, and then they've also added another category. It used to be called, I think, more problem plays, but now we actually talk about them as the romances, and not the romance, not in the sense of love story, but romance in the sense of sort of fantastical. So what did Shakespeare actually write? He wrote history plays, first of all. These are based on a true story. Now, you can go to your streaming platforms while you still have them and look at what's based on a true story. Look at what's based on a true story. Like half of the stuff on there is based on a true story. And it's a true story that we already know because we read about it in the papers. A huge chunk of Shakespeare's plays are based on a true story that his audience already knew. I just want you to think about that. Now, some of these stories have a kind of a superhero quality, right? Because it's like Henry V, kind of comes to power and he's very heroic. Some of them have this kind of heroic quality. And some of them have this quality of like the downfall of a king, like Lear. And so if you follow my advice and just like let your vision go soft and just sort of blur the details, like the downfall of a king. Oh, is that The Sopranos? Is it Breaking Bad? Or is it like what story? What is it? Like it's one of those stories, Is it the rise of a prince, becoming a king? Oh, is it Henry V? Or is it, I don't know, The Lion King? Like if you just blur the details, you start to see that what's beating at the heart of all these stories is really basic and it's sort of all the same. Shakespeare wrote comedies, and most of his comedies, I want to say all, but I don't want to say all without really thinking about it because I'm sure there's one could make an exception, but they're romantic comedies. They're romantic comedies. Now, you can go to your streaming services, like turn on, I don't know, the Hallmark Channel, and what do you find? You just find stories about couples that are clearly meant for each other, who bicker and who hit obstacles and funny things happen and they end up thrown together and somehow it all works out in the end. And this is just a genre of story that we love. And Shakespeare wrote a ton of them. He just loved to write romantic comedies. The other thing that Shakespeare wrote are tragedies, of course. And these tragedies tend to have, to me, like sort of subplot or subgenre potential to talk about them because some of them actually have elements of horror stories in them. There are horrific scenes in some of the tragedies, gruesome, bloody scenes. And they were there not in spite of the audience. They were there to please the audience because this was an audience that when they were done going to the theater, they'd go down the street and they watch bear baiting. Like this was an audience that loved its violence and bloodshed. If this audience could see today's horror movies, the Elizabethans would love it. They would go nuts for it. Okay. So there were elements of horror incorporated into Shakespeare's plays. Ghost story. Oh, heck yeah. I mean, one of the best ghosts in literature is the Hamlet's father, kicks that whole plot into motion. And there's also this sort of tragic romance type thing where sometimes, I don't know, I'm thinking of maybe Richard III or Iago, a character that the world sees as monstrous and yet craves love, can't get it, and guess what? Does terrible things. Where have I heard that story? Interesting. And there are mysteries too. Hamlet's kind of a mystery. So you could just see all these elements of genre are just sitting right there in this work that has been elevated as being kind of academic and high culture, but like there's nothing high culture about Shakespeare at the core. It's just popular entertainment, like based on popular genre. And the popular genre of Elizabethan times, guess what? They're the same popular genres of our own. I just want to touch also on the romances because the other genre that we love, fantasy. We love fantasy. How many books about fairies? How many books about wizards? Right? Are there? Well, look at Prospero, look at A Midsummer Night's Dream. Shakespeare was no stranger to writing stories that had a kind of a magic element, this sort of magical realism or fantasy element. They get kind of put aside sometimes as romances. Midsummer is considered a comedy. But here's the thing. about these categories is that there's a softness between them, right? Like you can see elements of horror in a tragedy, you can see elements of romance in a comedy, yeah. And one of the things that Shakespeare was actually extra good at that wasn't necessarily typical of all the other playwrights of his time was that he took these genres, which are all super audience catnip, and he mixed them up. He was like a genre mashup guy. And I just wanted to point that out because this remains something that's really compelling. And I'm just curious if this is something that we as writers today can think about in terms of all of that we've talked about today, right? All of this stuff about seizing the reader's heart and having a premise that's got something so strong and simple, keyword, baked in, that it could be told and retold and retold. Kindergartners could put it on and it would never fall apart. And this idea of just acknowledging the genres of stories that people love, have always loved, continue to love, and how can we work with that as well? So that's it. Now, here's my very last point. My very last point, and I'm going to circle back to something that Nancy pointed out in her note to me, which is that culture itself does help determine what gets labeled a classic. And this is certainly true. There's no argument about this. I had never thought about that question in terms of the Lindy effect before learning about the Lindy effect. So I want to just bring the Lindy effect back into the conversation. If something is never given a chance to get on stage, like if the comic is never given that opportunity to get on stage, there's no way that the Lindy effect can support them. They're just not going to have the chance to do it. And so when we talk about what's a classic and what's enduring, we also have to acknowledge that the culture has always played a role in who is allowed to have enough of a chance to get their work out. One of the things that makes Frankenstein so improbable is that it was written by a teenage girl, and I believe she had to publish it anonymously, right? And we know stories like this. She published it anonymously, and it managed to take off. And eventually it was revealed that she had written it. And now, thank goodness, we know it's not one of those works that's attributed to anonymous. It's Mary Shelley. Thank you very much. But I often go back to thinking of Virginia Woolf's wonderful essay, A Room of One's Own. And one of the delightful arguments in that essay is when Virginia Woolf says, imagine if Shakespeare had a sister. And she goes, there's a sort of a wonderful extrapolation of that what if Shakespeare had a sister? What if her name were Judith? Where are Judith's plays? Why aren't they classics? And so we get back to this question of, well, in Shakespeare's time, if there had been a Judith Shakespeare who was equally as gifted and endowed with ambition and hustle as her brother, her odds of becoming the author of an enduring classic works would be pretty slim. We still talk about the great actors of Shakespeare's time. Richard Burbage was the star of Shakespeare's company, and all those great roles were written for him. But women, of course, were not allowed to be professional actors at that time. Was there a Meryl Streep equivalent of Richard Burbage in Elizabethan England? We'll never know, because whoever she wasn't allowed to get on stage. So it's important to remember that. For most of us, we can find a way. We're fortunate in that sense that we can find a way to get our work out there, bringing the conversation back to us as writers. But for many years, there was a wonderful bookstore in New York called Judith's Room, and it was named after this imaginary Shakespeare sister named Judith in Virginia Woolf's essay, because Virginia Woolf said, well, what a woman needs to be a writer is, 500 pounds a year in a room of her own. And so this fantasy that if only Judith had a room and some money to live on, that she could have done it, I think is a beautiful image. Do I think that it's true? I don't know. I mean, Shakespeare didn't really have a room of his own. He was a busy guy. He was an entrepreneur. He had to hustle. But I do think that we have to find a way to get our work done and not crave necessarily, the literal, I need an income. I don't, in a room of my own. It's, we need to find our appropriate amount of ambition and just get the work done. But I just invite all of you, I want to wrap up now because we've been going on for a long time. But I'm going to bring this comment up from Anne, who is well informed, right? Still talking about Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. She had famous writer parents and husband, but still had to publish anonymously because no one at the time could believe a woman could have written the story. Exactly. So she had some advantages, but also some disadvantages. Absolutely. Thanks for filling in that detail, Anne. I really appreciate that. So my challenge to you, my friends, at the end of this conversation, Frankenstein, comedians in a delicatessen in New York, Shakespeare, really run the gamut today. But I just ask you to consider now whether you have thought about in the past consciously in your own work, striving for these qualities, and I'll just quickly review them. This quality of the emotional simplicity and resonance of your storytelling, not being shy about creating an iconic character, really looking at the genre and seeing if there's a way that you can elevate the genre elements in your own storytelling. Understanding that in order for your work to have any chance of becoming a classic, first people have to know about it. You've got to get out there. You've got to put your work out there and do what it takes to have people know about it. And all this other stuff we've talked about today. Think about it. Think about how you can use that to elevate your own work if you so choose. And if some of this triggers that sense of modesty that I know many of you have, and modesty is a virtue, but when we're artists, part of what we're saying is what I have to say is worth you hearing. That's actually, artists have to really inhabit that level of confidence as well. So we have to look at finding the right balance of that. But if you have even never allowed yourself to consider whether what you're sitting down to do when you write is to create something that could potentially endure for centuries, it's just an invitation. What if that were not so? What if you could say, well, I don't know, maybe it will endure for centuries. I hope this conversation has given you a sense of what might help that happen. I wish it for all of you, actually. Wouldn't that be fun? Wouldn't that be great? All right, my friends, thanks for being here live today. Love talking about this topic with all of you. Special thanks to those of you that sent me these emails that really helped me think through this topic, and your comments and your thoughts really elevated it and added some nice nuance and things for us to consider. And until the next time I see you, I wish you all a happy writing. And maybe what you work on between now and the next time we get together will be the start of a new classic. Thanks, everybody.